Good afternoon. Thank you to everyone who has made the effort to come and be here. Yes, so I've been looking forward to this talk for about a few months now, and yet this morning as I was trying to prepare, I was just having so much information in my head turning around that I started confusing details between one person and the other person. And so if I have to rummage through my pages to find a quote, it's because all three details of each individual person that I'm going to talk about has got mixed up in my head. But this is more a talk than a lecture, and I'm hoping that in the Festival of Ideas that this is an opportunity for me to sort of experiment. This is my own experiment with certain ideas. And I'm aware that some of you here are probably from some of the countries that I'm going to refer to in my talk. You probably know more about these individuals than I do, but I've tried to think about them in a certain light, in a particular way that connects to my own personal journey, and that's sort of what I want to talk about today. In the past 2 years, I have spoken to the Festival of Ideas, and I've looked at one particular individual who has made a difference in the world. So last year, I looked at a Japanese social reformer by the name of Toyohiko Kagawa. And that was, again, well attended. And it was easy to sort of focus on one individual, kind of really get into the depths of who this man was and what he did with his life. And the year before, I looked at an Indian social reformer by the name of Pandita Ramabai. I've done something slightly different this year because this sort of this talk or this journey of discovery for me has been going on for about 2 decades now. So this is hopefully a point at which we can have a conversation at the end of my talk, and I'm hoping that it'll continue on into the future because I feel like I'm trying to make sense of what does it mean to do, what does it mean to see social change happen, not at a national level, but at in a global level. So that's sort of the question mark there at the end as well. Given I've lived in 2 parts of the world and I've traveled quite a bit, there are certain questions I'm grappling with. So that's what I'm hoping to do with this talk. So I'm just sort of slightly waiting to see if there's anyone still coming in, but maybe I should just launch into the talk. In this talk today, I'm going to look at the lives of 3 men who as individuals saw significant change between the time they were born and by the time they died, the world that they were born into changed. And I'm incredibly intrigued and captivated by the lives of these 3 men. It is rather arbitrary, and I'm going to use this talk to show how I see connections between these men and also sort of how together they represent something that is worth considering, exploring, and even maybe pursuing. So let me just say a little bit about my own journey as I began to sort of come to thinking about this talk. I was born and raised in India. I come from the south of India in Chennai, used to be called Madras. Grew up in a Protestant Christian home that was primarily either apolitical or anti-political. We had nothing to do. Christianity in India is often quite divorced from public life or politics. You know, we are a minority community, and we try to kind of keep our heads down, and as long as we can sort of do our Christian bit, we don't get too involved in politics. And I did not grow up in a home where politics was given any place of prominence or was discussed or was seen as important. And yet, in my own journey, I began to feel a sense of asking questions about justice, about law, and then ended up studying politics. And in 1998, I moved from India to come to live here in the UK. And it is here in the UK that you begin to ask questions about your identity, particularly as you think about what does it mean to be a post-colonial Indian living in the land that was formerly the colonizing country that you're from. And it is here that I increasingly began to grapple with the cultural fractures of my own story, my own world, and I began to discover that actually India and Britain are deeply intertwined. Our stories are irreversibly interconnected. And there is a lot of history that is worthy, and there's a lot of history that is painful and damning. In the course of my work in the UK, I began to travel to the Netherlands. I began to spend quite a bit of time there. My wife is Dutch, who's here. And I also began to sort of see that the Netherlands became a part of my world, and I've gone there in the last 20 years probably about 50 times. Or maybe 40 actually. And I studied there and I worked there. And then I also then had the opportunity to go down to South Africa, and I worked there in 2000, leading a school, or 2005. And then finally, the other part of the puzzle for me was spending time in America. I just returned from America last week. My wife and I were in New Orleans, and again, if you go to the South in America, you begin to see another side of the American story, particularly with slavery, with segregation, with racism. And so my brother and sister lived there, and I've got to know America well. So this sort of, in a sense, those 5 flags that you see here, which are contemporary symbols of those nations, if you look back at the flag of South Africa from 50 years ago, it would be a different flag, or the flag of India from 80 years ago. So this is part of my own journey of trying to make sense of the world we live in, and what will it take to make a difference. Let me sort of share with you a little bit about understanding the context of these 3 men, and I've got some images there that give you a window into the kind of world that Ghandi and King and Mandela were born into. When Ghandi was born in India, there was British imperialism there. In America, we see segregation and racism, and in South Africa, we see apartheid. And there are differences, of course, in each of these different parts of the world in 3 different continents, and yet there are also similarities, or there's a common denominator. And I'm going to suggest, I'm working this through, I'm going to suggest that the common denominator that is something you have to understand if you're going to understand the lives of Ghandi, King, and Mandela. Each of them very different from each other, and I'll talk about the differences. But something that seems to be common to the 3 worlds that I'm talking about is what I've called white Protestant exceptionalism. These are terms that are loaded, I know, and there are terms that have to be unpacked. And again, using the word like white is problematic, because it's not a catch-all phrase. I mean, there were Irish white people in India, and there were English eaten educated white people in India. So there are differences. There are differences in South Africa between the Afrikaners and the British. So, but I use that term because to me it helps me understand how the narrative of these 3 individuals unfolded. It unfolded in the context of the social structures that came into place as a result of white Protestant exceptionalism, as I call it. Now, there are other kinds of exceptionalism. There is Hindu exceptionalism, there's Islamic exceptionalism. That's not unique, but I'm particularly focused on white Protestant exceptionalism. And at the heart of white Protestant exceptionalism are what I call the 3 things that I mentioned. I can't unpack this, and I'm happy to sort of grapple with this during Q&A. It was this idea of the logic of providence. God has ordained for us as people to have a certain kind of authority or to rule over. The idea of providence, there was the logic of providence that was at the heart of white Protestant exceptionalism, which meant that justifies what you do. You cannot justify things like imperialism or segregation, apartheid, unless you come up with a way to explain it. And the logic of providence was one of the things that gave Protestants the belief that they were on the right side of history and they were at the forefront of it. Of course, the second point I've mentioned there is the logic of progress, which means if human beings are considered progressing, we are the most progressed. So combined with providence and progress, the logic of progress, you get the logic of power, which means we are therefore history has uniquely placed on us the responsibility to dispense to the rest of humanity the blessings of civilizational progress. So that's how some of these systems come into place. That's my argument, or at least what I'm suggesting. Because unless you understand this both in its merits and its faults, you can't understand how Gandhi's life and King's life and Mandela's life, the outworking of their lives, because they were engaging something that was the other, and that at the heart of that other was white Protestant exceptionalism. I want to talk about these. The PowerPoint hasn't moved, Jonathan. I'm sorry about that. Carry on, I'll just get it down. Okay. Doesn't help when you don't have your PowerPoint. I think I have it here in front of me. I'm going to talk about each of these men as individuals for a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about them together, and then I've got sort of some closing remarks on what we can learn for them for the 21st century world. Of course, much can be said about each of these individuals. As I was trying to prepare for this talk, and by the way, I've got some of my books that I've read or used for this talk that is there on the table in the back. You can take a look at it later. There are over 400 books available written about the lives of these men. They have been overstudied and over-researched, and so there's no way I can speak with any authority except that I've done a bit of my homework. And so let me just mention a few things about each of these individuals just to get the flavor of who we are talking about. Mahatma Gandhi, of course, was born in India. He was born in the 19th century. He came from a home where his father was the chief minister to the ruler of the particular province where he was born. His mother was a very devout woman who had quite an inclusive kind of faith. She was a Hindu, but she was also very sympathetic to Jainism. And he grew up in an environment believing that he was meant to have some kind of leadership because his father was already a man of social standing. But he's a very shy boy. He's not particularly excellent at schooling, and he was able to convince his mother and makes a promise to her that she did not want him to leave India, but he convinces his mother that he wants to go to London to study law. His brother had already studied law and was in Bombay, and Gandhi comes to London to study law at University College, and he's here for 3 years. And it's very interesting how this is the first time he is actually in the land of the people that rule India. And it's quite a confusing time for him, because on one hand there's stories of him thinking early on that if he started eating meat he could also become strong like the white people. And he was guilty. He felt a great sense of shame that he was doing it privately, while he had promised his mother he wouldn't eat meat, drink wine, or womanize. Somewhere in the midst of that he meets some key people, including people like Annie Besant in the Theosophical Society, and joins the Vegetarian Society in London. And by the time he leaves to go back to India after his time here, he has come to some understanding that even though he was shy, even though he was quite reclusive, that he had some deep convictions about justice. There was a committee meeting. I shouldn't spend too much time on these slides because there's so many little nuggets I could tell. There was a meeting in the Vegetarian Society, and the guy who was the president, I think, was very close to this person. But there was another member who was trying to promote contraception. And the president felt like that was not acceptable for people in the Vegetarian Society to be promoting contraception, because killing was unacceptable. But Gandhi felt very strongly that we must allow people to say and do what is right in their conscience, and we shouldn't exclude them. Even though when they had the vote and Gandhi couldn't even speak, he had to give his viewpoint in writing, and this member was excluded, you begin to see in Gandhi a great conviction about his ideas of right and wrong. He goes back to India, not much happens, and then through only what can be described as coincidences or unexplainable providential happenstance, he ends up going to South Africa to work on a law case for a Muslim family. And it is in South Africa that his life takes a 180-degree turn, because in South Africa, and it's hard to know how much of it was his own feeling that he was culturally superior to the blacks. Early on, you see in some of his writings that sometimes comes across, but he believed that he was entitled to certain things, or he had the right to be treated well because he had studied in London. He came from a respectable family, and yet there is that incident in Pietermaritzburg where he had bought a first-class train ticket and he was traveling on the train, and the train conductor, train guard, kicked him out. He was in a cold night. If you see the film, there's a story, there's a bit where he has his ticket and he says, I bought the ticket and I have an entitlement to be in the first class compartment, and he's kicked out. And he spends the night in a cold train station in South Africa, which becomes his moment of political awakening. He decides that he is meant to do something to fight injustice. All sorts of things happen in South Africa, including he gets arrested, he mobilizes the Indian community. I have visited his home in South Africa, in Durban, and you begin to see how Gandhi discovers his leadership. And he has some very close friends there, including some Christian friends who try to convert him, and he doesn't accept that. He doesn't want to do something that goes against his conscience. He returns to India in 1915, just as World War I was going on, and that begins his sort of journey in India of becoming the leader of India's freedom movement. One of the things Gandhi does, which he had a remarkable gift for, is the Congress party at that time was mainly people from middle class, upper middle class background, intellectuals who were talking to each other about how they need to somehow bring some kind of improvement to Indians. Gandhi turns all that on its head and says that actually the Congress party had to become a mass movement. And he travels on the third class of Indian trains, meeting ordinary Indians who are suffering in British India, and becomes the voice of the masses, the peasants. And that was one of his biggest contribution. Of course, we see in his life, he comes to Cambridge actually. He was friends with a man named C.F. Andrews. I've got a book on the table there of his friendship with this Anglican Englishman, and they were very close friends. And C.F. Andrews was from the college name, Pembroke. And Gandhi visited Pembroke. I'm told that there is a photo somewhere here in Cambridge of Gandhi's visit there. And Gandhi increasingly keeps practicing what he sees as this thing called satyagraha, the power of truth, the soul force that gave him this conviction that he must stand up to injustice, that he must stand up to oppression. But tragically, what happens is, let me just mention again, there's the Salt March where he defies the British laws that say you can't make salt, and he goes out on his march on the photo on the right there, on the top right. And India and Pakistan become independent countries. Tragically, India is divided between Muslim Pakistan and a secular India. And Gandhi is assassinated on the 30th of January 1948 by a Hindu fanatic. In fact, it was not the British who killed Gandhi, it was a Hindu fanatic who believed that Gandhi's ideas will ultimately destroy India. So much can be said about Gandhi's life, including the run-ins he had with Churchill. Let me maybe read one quick quote of what Churchill said about Gandhi. "It is alarming and nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a sedacious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir of the type well known in the East, striding half naked up the steps of the viceregal palace, while he is still organizing and conducting a defiant campaign of disobedience, and to parley on equal terms with the representative of the King Emperor." Churchill and Gandhi did not like each other, and they represented very different worlds. Let me say something about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was born on January 15th, 1929. He was actually named Michael King Jr., and his dad actually changed his name to Martin Luther King Sr., and so then Michael King became Martin Luther King Jr. He was an exceptionally studious boy. He in fact was able to do so well that he could move 2 levels in his schooling, and he graduated from Morehouse College and went on to study theology and got a bachelor's degree in his early 20s, and later of course went to Boston University to do his PhD on Paul Tillich. He was a gifted preacher, and he was somebody that had the gift of communication, and Martin Luther King was seen by one of the leaders who was trying to organize a protest after Rosa Parks, the black woman who refused to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and they chose Martin Luther to be the sort of frontman. He was still in his early 20s to lead the boycott, and the boycott went on for over a year, and this sort of threw him into the sort of prominence of being a public leader. He knew he had that leadership. He knew he had that leadership in the church. But that incident, that was his political awakening of what he saw to black women who had spent all day working, and they were asked to give up their seat when white men got on the bus. They then set up, a group of men set up the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, and he's elected the president, and he was president till he died. Of the 3 men we're looking, Martin Luther King was explicitly Christian till his dying day, and was the youngest of the 3 men who only lived till he was 39. So Martin Luther King achieved what he did achieve in just a period of 15 years actually. He visits India. The trip that he makes to India is very interesting because he goes to India to study about Gandhi's methods of non-violence and social change. And he comes to the city that I'm from, and he is well received in India because they see suddenly that Gandhi is beginning to be recognized as a world leader by people in another part of the world. There's of course his famous speech in which he talks about "I have a dream," and he repeatedly mentions that his dream is for an America in which people are included in the promise that all human beings have equal rights. He is given the Nobel Prize on the 10th of December 1964, and he was only 35 years old when he was given the Nobel Prize. He was the youngest person to be given the Nobel Peace Prize. Of course, that was long before Mandela came around. And then we see him assassinated by I've forgotten the name of the person who assassinated him. No, I shall get his name in a second. He was assassinated while standing in a motel room in Memphis, and his life came to an end. And there's always the theory that he was assassinated not by some lone assassin, but it was a state assassination. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, called Martin Luther King enemy number one of the American state. He was disliked, and he became even white Americans started turning on Martin Luther King Jr. because towards the end of his life, towards the last 3 years of his life, he started speaking out against the Vietnam War. A lot of white people followed his leadership as long as he was speaking out against racial segregation in America. But once he started touching on the issue of the American military and the war campaign that they were having in Vietnam, killing human beings with no discrimination, indiscriminately, Martin Luther became very disliked. It is only after he died he became the sort of celebrity we know him today. But when he actually died, he was quite a disliked and hated figure. And finally, I want to talk about Nelson Mandela. Again, so much can be said about these men, born into a home where, like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, they had a sense of social standing. His father was again a prime minister to a chief, and he knew he was born into a role that he would have in the future. He goes to study in a Methodist university in Fort Harare, and he gets expelled for leading a protest. And like Gandhi, who was able to mass mobilize the Indian National Congress, Nelson Mandela forms the ANC youth wing, and he begins to recruit young people who are quite, I think, quite angry that the leadership of the ANC were just talking about gradual change. What Mandela wanted to see was radical change, because in 48 the Nationalist Party, the White Nationalist Party, had come to power, and the foundations of apartheid were being put in place. Mandela's life is interesting because unlike Gandhi and King, Mandela always, I think, thought that you couldn't do what Gandhi did in South Africa, because once your interlocutor begins to use indiscriminate force or violence at a degree that there is no justification to just do it passively. So he starts the military wing of the ANC called Umkhonto we Sizwe, the sphere of the nation. And of course later he is put on trial, and he is sent to jail, he's sent to prison in Robben Island. Let me read a quote of what Nelson Mandela said at the conclusion of his trial. "During my lifetime, I have dedicated my life to the struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all people will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." As we know, Mandela was sent to prison. He was in prison for 27 years. And of course, he's released in 1990. We have those images of him coming out, holding hands with his then wife, Winnie Mandela, and becomes the first president of a democratic South Africa. And he died in 2013. Again, much can be said about Mandela's life, little snippets. He was actually a fellow at Magdalen College, and he was given an honorary doctorate from here in Cambridge. And he, of the three men, went on to hold public office. He became the president of South Africa. Unlike Gandhi and King, he was not assassinated, and he also, I think, had more admiration for Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India, than for Gandhi. He felt like Gandhi was not, Gandhi's method, while had many things to teach him, he felt like it didn't help him when you hold public office. And there's an interesting sort of combination of these three men as I've tried to grapple with what they have to teach us for the 21st century. Okay, let me just now move on from talking about these men individually to kind of talking about them together. Of course, I've already said Ghandi and Mandela both studied law. It's very interesting that they had a law background, which meant they also began to see the issues of injustice, how the law can be used as an instrument of injustice. King, on the other hand, was primarily, he described this himself as a gospel preacher. He saw his job in the pulpit, and yet he was thrown to national prominence. And at one point, the Democratic Party was discussing as to whether they should nominate him for president as one of the candidates to run as a Democratic president for the United States. King refused that. He said his calling was to do God's work, which for him was primarily what he did in the church. But of course, King also brought about significant changes, including the Civil Rights Act that was passed after he died. As I mentioned, there's differences between them. King and Ghandi believed and practiced non-violence. For Ghandi particularly, the idea of the soul force can only happen if you practice non-violence. You cannot practice violence and still be committed to the truth. King was influenced by Ghandi, but King also saw that non-violence was consistent with the Christian gospel, particularly the teachings of Jesus. Whereas Mandela, on the other hand, started the sort of the military wing of the ANC and did not ever justify killing people, but you can realize that if you're head of state, you have an army at your disposal. You can't talk about pacifism if you're the president of a country. Finally, of course, King and Mandela were given Nobel Peace Prizes. Ghandi wasn't, even though he was nominated twice, and I wonder if at that time part of the Nobel Peace Prize committee felt like they didn't want to upset the British by giving Ghandi a Nobel Prize. I think he should have been given a prize, but he's not included in that list. And of course, as we know, King was explicitly Christian. I've got a book on the back table there on titled Spiritual Mandela, which talks about Mandela's Christian faith. Even though we know him, and a lot of commentators said he was a secular humanist, he had a very deep Christian faith, particularly a Methodist faith, a nonconformist informed faith that that even the hymns that they sang at his funeral came from the Methodist tradition. Ghandi, on the other hand, was profoundly attracted to Jesus, but he always remained a Hindu. So we cannot harmonize their stories. They're very individual, different stories. So let me move to the next PowerPoint slide, Jonathan. Thank you. Why these three men? I have titled them the Brothers of Freedom. You know, if they were part of one family, what they wanted was freedom. But it was not the kind of freedom that was revolutionary, of overthrowing all social structures and creating an anarchy, but a freedom that I would kind of describe as a freedom that wanted to put right the relationship between those who were colonizing and those who were colonized, between those who were the white oppressor in America and the oppressed black people in the American South. Let me just look at my notes on a couple of points that I wanted to make about the three different contexts in which they lived. India, of course, is a predominantly Hindu country, and after the end of imperialism, the British left India. So India is actually, in a sense, the experiment in living out the freedoms that Ghandi wanted is very different in India today. And minority communities like Muslims and Christians are affected based on the Hindu majority. So that was India. Whereas in the United States, the black population of the United States and the white population have to live together. And the whites are numerically the majority, and the blacks were oppressed. Whereas in South Africa, the blacks were the majority and the whites were the minority. So again, each of these countries have very different sort of what made up the situation in which these men provided the leadership that we saw. What I want to do in terms of offering similarities, and I want to finish here with this final PowerPoint, talking about what we can learn, what these three brothers of freedom can teach us for the 21st century world. And this is sort of my interpretation. This is sort of where I wanted to go. I find in these three men lessons about some key ideals that would help us in the 21st century. And I might seem like somebody who is maybe idealistic, but this talk, of course, talks about these universal ideals, and I'm going to talk about what I think are these universal ideals. The first one that I see in Mahatma Gandhi's life is a commitment to truth. He had a deep and profound commitment to this search for truth. He in fact titled his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. And truth, the way Gandhi understood, was not just this sort of intellectual or a rational kind of truth, but a truth that had to be embodied, a truth that has to be lived out in relation to the other. And I see that as being one of the, if we're going to see social change that is sustainable, we have to have that commitment to truth, particularly in a sort of a post-truth fake news world. What does it mean to say we are committed to the truth? That's the question that I think Ghandi wants us to grapple with. And that truth has to be one that is from deep within who we are. It's not just a fake truth that we put on to achieve pragmatic ends. It's not a pragmatic kind of truth. There's a sense in which he gave his life for it, and he said he will die for it. The second thing that I want to mention about Martin Luther King's life is the idea of justice. And Martin Luther King, I think, again and again uses the word justice in his speeches. He talked about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. You know, he saw that whole of history is bending towards the point of world justice. And yet it was a kind of justice that was not retributive or a punishing kind of justice. It was a justice that was primarily seeking to restore the dignity of the people that had been oppressed, but also bring the people that did the oppression into a right relationship with those who were oppressed. So that was sort of what he called himself a drum major for justice. And we have to think about the question of justice because here is a man who himself experienced incredible injustice and yet talked about a kind of justice that I think is not about justice where we will come and now destroy the lives of the people that did bad things to us, but a justice that puts things right. Let me just quickly say, all of these men, of course, had a commitment to justice, of course, and I'm sort of teasing out different key things that I want to mention. Mandela was a statesman of peace. And it's very interesting, you know, how initially he wanted to sort of bring about revolutionary change, but his 27 years in prison changed him. He began to think about the world differently. He learned Afrikaans because he wanted to build bridges with his prison guards, and he saw that somewhere in the future he would have to be a leader for the Afrikaans people. He goes and, you know, identifies with rugby, which was a sport that was so identified with racism. He goes and has tea with the wife of the judge who sentenced him. He saw peace as something where he said something like, you can't make peace by talking to your friends, you've got to make peace with your enemies. He was a statesman of peace. In fact, he was criticized and dismissed, including Mugabe was quite dismissive of Mandela, because I think partly Mugabe was upset that Nelson Mandela became the sort of elder statesman of Africa, and Mugabe called him, he's a cop-out, he's become a saint for white people. But Mandela deeply believed that we must work for peace. It's an ideal that is in the best interest of both the people that had been oppressed and the people who did the oppressing. But the last point I want to make, and I will stop with this, and then we can take some Q&A, is what I've come to see in these three men as I've studied their lives, as I've studied their context from where they came. They seem to me animated by an ethic of mercy for the other. Now, mercy is not such an easy concept to in terms of political thought. I find mercy difficult to conceptualize, to theorize on. Mercy seems to be a religious term, and yet as somebody whose background is in politics and international relations, I've been thinking quite a bit about mercy. And I'm going to say this because I'm still working on trying to see how mercy can inform public policy, or mercy can inform how we do political life. And I think these men have something to teach us. For a long time in history, mercy was a very important feature of governance. Kings were meant to show mercy, and in this way they reflected who the gods were. But something begins to change in the face of in the period of modernity, where people like Hobbes and Hume kind of they think mercy is too arbitrary. Mercy doesn't make sense when they theorize about the state, when they theorize about power relations, and increasingly mercy is not included. We do include truth, justice and peace, but mercy is not included. And I think what is so interesting about the lives of these three men is that it was not the powerful that were showing mercy to the weak. It was the people that had been in the weak situation, who had been in the oppressed situation, that are showing mercy to the ones who had the power. And I think it is mercy that makes us want to remember these men. There's something very attractive about these three men. They're not saints. Of course, they are giants in their own terms of social change, but they're not saints. And yet we do want to know about their lives. We want to see what made them who they were. Why are they being remembered the way they are? Why are there statues of these men all around the world? There were many things that were wrong with them. I could give a whole lecture on things that you can criticize about King and Gandhi and Mandela, and yet for me the heart of what makes these men great is that they were animated by an ethic of mercy that ultimately informs how they have lived their lives and what they wanted for their nations, what Gandhi wanted for India. There was a time when India and Pakistan were fighting over assets, and Gandhi goes into a fast to say, no, we should give that money to Pakistan. We shouldn't hold back those assets, even though we are in a war at the moment. And that's what made him a scandal, or that made the Hindu nationalists justify killing him. We see that in King's life. He talks about the beloved community. So I hope what I've been able to do here is talk about these three men who have something to teach us, particularly as we go from living in a world where we are primarily focused about the nation. In the 21st century, it's going to be about what kind of ideals are going to inform how we do life in a global world, on a global scale. So that was my talk. Thank you.